Hello, and welcome to a book launch for The Apocalypse and the End of History by my wonderful colleague, who is at least on my screen down here to my left, Suzanne Schneider. This is
recording in progress.
Okay, this is an excellent book, which we're going to be talking about for the next, bit. And really it centers on this question of how does the phenomenon of modern jihad echo the crises of Western liberalism? In Susie's book, The Apocalypse and the End of History, Modern Jihad and the Crisis of Liberalism, Susie argues that contemporary jihad, far from being some kind of like medieval holdover, and something I think I'd like to talk about later in the session, is in fact bears a striking resemblance to the reactionary political formations and acts of spectacular violence that have been upending life in Western democracies. From authoritarian populism to mass shootings, xenophobic nationalism, and the allure of conspiratorial thinking, modern jihad seems to be less the antithesis of Western neoliberalism and more a dark reflection of its inner logic. And I am very excited to be talking about this, and we are very grateful to Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, to Verso Books, and to Community Bookstore, who are all co-sponsoring this event. I should say my name is Ajay Singh Chaudhary. I am the Executive Director of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and our core faculty member specializing in social and political theory. In my current work, I'm working on political theory and climate change. And joining us tonight, in order of which they will be speaking, so Susie will go first, and then Murtaza Hussain. Murtaza is, sorry, I have everyone's bio on the next page. The national security journalist at the Intercept, and his reporting on sort of questions in these geographies and of these topics has been wonderful and vital over these past number of years. And to my immediate left, at least on my screen, is Patrick Blanchfield, who is also a faculty member here at the Brooklyn Institute of Research, and whose book on, I believe, it's still called Gunpower, correct, Pat? Yeah, will be out next year, and we're very much looking forward to that as well. So I think, and then finally, I should introduce Susie, not only the author of this book, but also her previous book, Mandatory Separation, Religion, Education, and Mass Politics in Palestine. Suzanne Schneider is Deputy Director and core faculty at the Brooklyn Institute of Research. She specializes in the political and social history of the modern Middle East. She is the author of Mandatory Separation, which I just mentioned, and she writes broadly about political violence, militancy, American foreign policy, including recently on Afghanistan for foreign policy. And I think it is important to sort of cite that much more than the 9/11 holiday that I think we're supposed to sort of be citing, but that the final and very welcome, at least to my mind, withdrawal of American troops and forces from Afghanistan sort of is a really nice sort of launching pad to me for thinking about a lot of the topics that Susie brings up in this book. But in any case, she has written about American foreign policy for outlets including The Washington Post, Mother Jones, Foreign Policy, Los Angeles Review of Books, and M+1. So without further ado, Suzanne, or Susie, can I call you Susie on something this formal or not? I can't, it's hard for me to hold it back.
Ajay, it would be very strange for me if you called me something other than Susie after all these years.
So lots of things to talk about. Very excited. Susie, take it away.
All right. Well, hello and welcome. If you're watching from home, thanks for being here in digital form. And again, I just want to reiterate Ajay's thanks to the folks at Brooklyn Institute and Verso and Community Bookstore for making this happen. And just to also say thank you to Ajay, Murtaza, and Patrick. It's like a wonderful honor to be able to rope in smart people and then make them talk about your ideas. And I'm grateful that I was able to throw my lasso around you three for this one. And really just finally, at least I want to just, before we dive into tonight's discussion, make sure to extend my thanks to my husband, Yono, and to my amazing crew of girlfriends who are really propping me up in more ways than I can count right now. Okay, so kind of with some preliminaries, notes of thanks here out of the way. I'm going to begin by saying a little bit about why I wrote this book and kind of how it came to assume the form that it did, before kind of drawing on a few like specific examples, from the text itself that I hope will elucidate some of the points I'm trying to make. So Ajay, as you mentioned, kind of by way of passing, right? So it's nearly 20 years ago to the day that the attacks of 9/11 made jihad a household term in the United States. And it was an utterly strange and unfamiliar thing to many people, really myself included. And I think particularly surreal, maybe to people around my age, right? Like I was born in 1983, and we'd kind of grown up in the 90s during this decade of relative peace and prosperity. And so it seemed, and then suddenly the sky was falling. And I was a freshman in college in Manhattan at the time. I just kind of like newly arrived from South Dakota. I knew next to nothing about the worlds of Islam or the Middle East. I certainly didn't know about the history of Afghanistan or of American involvement in the region, nor did I know anything about the kind of growing tide of Islamist politics or the internal shifts that had revolutionized the practice of jihad over the last several decades. And people at this time obviously wanted answers to explain these attacks, and pretty soon a whole industry had grown up around this demand. And there were, assorted academic takes mixed in that tried to offer greater nuance, but the dominant narrative quickly became something like this, right? That jihad is this strange relic of this barbaric past that is perpetrated by those who hate our freedom, and that ours is consequently this clash of civilizations, fought against an other who is our utter negation. And that these tropes are tried and easily repudiated has not lessened their appeal. And it's still common to find liberals bemoaning the quote unquote medieval quality of jihad and the militant groups who call for it. And the idea that Islam was uniquely prone to violence in ways that went far and beyond other religions was key to this narrative. And it should go without saying at this point, but these ideas about jihad and its place within Islam were tied to a particular political project, dehumanizing Muslims in order to surveil them at home and to bomb them abroad, to justify a new wave of imperial exploit, to reorganize American society around a futile quest for security through state violence and force, and to engage in a massive and endless war on terror. So this book is my attempt to intervene in this conversation and to tell a different type of story, not about the barbarians at the gate and how quote unquote they are so unlike us, but rather the ways in which today's jihad lays bare a common political, economic, and social logic that has come to mark the waning days of liberalism. And whether we look to the fetishization of individualism, the adoption of digital media to forge new kinds of global community, the embrace of governance as management, or the use of violence as spectacle, contemporary jihad reveals much of what is latent in quote unquote our own political and social forms. And from this light, I argue jihad and neoliberalism appear much less like oppositional political projects than as two sides of a single and very badly worn coin. And so much, it's just said, I'll just kind of say one more little word about this, right? So much of our politics depends on creating these sharp demarcations between us and them, so to speak, right? This is kind of the logic that the clash of civilizations draws upon. And among other things, this book wants to unsettle these distinctions. Jihad, as it manifests today, is by no means a product of a less civilized era, but of a modernity that we experience as well, although in different ways. Nor are its practitioners, many of whom hold advanced degrees in engineering and business administration, anything other than products of the modern world. If there is a barbarism here, it is one that is deeply embedded in the world that we hold in common. And we can't just shoo it away by pretending that jihad can be accounted for wholly within the boundaries of Islam. So, but I want to back up a second, because understanding how I got to this set of conclusions, I think requires a little bit more in the way of explanation. So let's start by maybe some of the books on this topic that you may have encountered. So if you've kind of read a book about jihad, chances are it's this like narrative, and it starts with like the Prophet Muhammad, and then it says like what the Quran and the Hadith have to say about the topic, and then maybe it jumps to like the Crusades, and then finally to Osama bin Laden and the creation of Al-Qaeda. It's just this one big continuous chain. And indeed, this idea that jihad assumes a singular form over time is part of why people think of it as a quote unquote medieval phenomenon. But here's the rub. If people wage jihad because of verses in the Quran, then shouldn't this have always been something that has been happening throughout human history, like a constant part of every single century and every decade, rather than this exceptional thing that it is? So how can we explain the centuries in which the Islamic world and the kind of Western world were not beset by this type of militancy if this is supposed to kind of stem naturally from certain verses that appear in the Quran? Right, I asked this question in the book, and I'll kind of pose it again here, that if Islam is the problem, then shouldn't have always been a problem. How do we, again, explain these kind of centuries of kind of a lull? So mine is one that tries to kind of it tries to look at this in through a historical framework, right? I'm a historian, so it's all kind of right and proper from a disciplinary framework. And historical treatment of jihad just doesn't support the idea that it's a singular or essential phenomenon that exists in the same form over space and time. And rather, the fact is that we are living through an unprecedented period in which militant actors claiming the mantle of jihad contest the established state system, attack the elites that oversee it. And my story, focused as it is on the Islamic State, is only one facet of this, right? There are overlapping characteristics with Al-Qaeda or even the Taliban, but I will beg you not to equate them all. Not only do they despise one another, but they advance really different types of projects, right? And while a group like the Taliban is broadly recognizable within the framework of 20th century revolutionaries or even anti-colonial insurgencies, even as they advance this fundamentally reactionary framework, the Islamic State's community is novel for being nowhere sovereign yet everywhere existent, one kind of truly global and digitally mediated in a way that firmly belongs to our own era of being very online. So all of this is to say that even if we back up a century, we don't even have to back up like a millennia or like several hundred years. Even if we back up a century, we'll find that jihad didn't exist in the forms that we experience it today, right? This is just like a basic historical observation that then kind of calls upon us to ask a different sort of questions. Indeed, the legal literature around jihad is often incredibly dry and practical in nature, stipulating the proper mode of conduct for soldiers, the types of weaponry that are allowed, the requirements like guarding places of worship that are incumbent upon warring forces. But perhaps most importantly, jihad is regarded within this kind of classic legal literature of Islamic jurisprudence as a tool of states and rulers. Individuals do not wage jihad any more so than 18th century peasant could wage war on a neighboring kingdom. For much of its history, jihad was simply the Muslim way of war, and it's a tool, again, of states and rulers, not of individuals. It's worth recalling that when the Ottoman Empire entered World War I, it did so with a declaration of jihad, calling up the faithful to fight as conscripts, not as vigilantes. Right. And you see this kind of echoed in the Islamic legal literature within the Sunni tradition, at least, with the notion that jihad is a collective obligation rather than an individual one, and the kind of dominant treatment, meaning it's viewed as a communal responsibility, not something like prayer that individuals can and must do on their own terms. Now, fast forward to the end of the 20th century, and you find Osama bin Laden, a man with no state to lead, no soldiers to draft, no scholastic qualifications that would have traditionally enabled him to issue legal rulings. This is simply not the same jihad. From being a mode of warfare tied to states, jihad became an insurgent tactic over the course of the 20th century. And that, I believe, is a shift that has to be explained, with its new targets being the Muslim rulers, largely in kind of post-colonial states, but also their American enablers. So far from being a medieval formation, some pretty elemental shifts had to occur for this change to occur, regarding questions of legitimacy and expertise, of authority and governance, of violence and its applications, indeed of the nature of individual responsibility. But it's very hard to tell this story if you think we're still in the Middle Ages. So on the one hand, my book is an attempt to offer a historical treatment of a phenomenon that's often taken to be essentially the same over time, and to disrupt this characterization by showing these kind of important points of rupture. And this enables us to see jihad as a kind of a shapeshifter of sorts, and then to ask a different set of questions, not why is Islam violent or something of this form, but why has this particular form of violence become common today and not in the past? What is it about the past several decades that's been so generative of this new form of militancy? And finally, if today's jihad doesn't look like its predecessors from within the long and varied course of Islamic history, well, then what exactly does it look like? So this is kind of the first, I would say, half of the book. Um, and kind of leads us, though, directly to the second, where I kind of trade my historian's hat for the tools of political and social theory to ask a different set of questions than those that are typically in circulation regarding conversations about jihad. Not why do they hate our freedom, but who is the mujahid, one who engages in jihad, as a political subject? What types of agency or responsibility does he or she have? What is the relationship here to authority? What views of the social and political community prevail? How do militants think about governance? Right? This is like a whole set of questions that is both incredibly crucial and yet so infrequently posed to this kind of collection of sources or to these social phenomenon. And indeed, posing questions at this level led me to places that I had not anticipated at the outset of this project. And indeed, the comparisons that I make in this book to reactionary movements in the Western world emerged not because I was looking for them, but because the more I looked into Islamic State sources, the more I saw that certain political and social shifts were occurring at a global scale, and I could not account for what I was seeing purely by remaining within these comfortable boundaries of Islamic studies or even Middle Eastern history. So I'm going to offer just a few little, or two really examples here before kind of turning it over for some discussion. We can take these two little anecdotes, both of which I discuss in the book in greater length. So how, for instance, should we understand a statement like the following? This is drawn from a 2014 Islamic State recruiting video. Oh, brothers and sisters, open the Quran and everything will become clear to you. All the scholars are telling you, oh, this is a fard, a legal obligation. This is not a fard, again, a legal obligation. This is not the time to jihad. Forget everyone. Read the Quran, read the book of Allah, the instruction of life, and you will find out what jihad is, and if you're meant to do jihad or not. So this statement came from 25-year-old British Muslim of kind of Bangladeshi origins, whose nom de guerre was Abu Bara al-Hindi. He possessed limited Arabic language skills, no formal legal training, and a reported penchant before his radicalization for football drinking and nightclubs. Right, traditionally speaking, he did determining these conditions under which individuals are obliged to engage in jihad. It was a pretty complicated exercise. Was this jihad declared by a legitimate ruler? Do you live in the vicinity of the battle? Did you get permission from your parents? These are not hypothetical questions. These are real questions in this legal literature. But these questions were also of no interest to our young fighter, who rather viewed the Quran as a standalone text that could be understood by the average person apart from the body of accompanying body of legal commentary, and I think importantly, could just be read in solitary outside of a communal framework to deduce some sort of kind of moral or ethical lessons. This is not a traditional way of approaching the Quran, though. Which is only one part of a legal tradition that includes the hadith, the saying prophets, the sayings and deeds of the prophets, an abundance of commentators who don't necessarily agree with one another. And yet this is cast aside in favor of a form of religiosity that is unmistakably modern and specifically Protestant, and one that also belittles scholarly expertise as corrupting and ultimately quite unnecessary. Indeed, this anti-establishment element here is not a one-off. The Islamic State publications are littered with disdain for traditional religious authorities, the ulama, not merely because of the sort of scholastic disputations in which they are engaged are viewed as muddling the essential and simple truth, but because in the post-colonial state, they became something like court priests, no longer playing a mediating role between rulers and society, but serving to legitimate an increasingly repressive state apparatus. I quote for you here from another publication from the Islamic State: the caliphate had been opposed and forsaken by the wise ones, in scare quotes, the theorizers, the elders, who labeled them as being khawarij, as being kharijites, so outside of the community. This is the substance of attacks on many prominent Sunni clerics who are alive today. And really, you know, and this isn't just a kind of a rhetorical matter we need to underscore. Right, in 2017, Audio Message drove home the point by calling upon supporters to assassinate prominent members of the ulama living in Egypt and other Arab countries. And we should also recall that soon after the announcement of the caliphate in 2014, the Islamic State moved to quickly kill 13 scholars in Mosul who opposed their takeover. right? So this break with a kind of an establishment force is quite elemental here, even though it's kind of, I think, less commented upon. Using an elite class then that is widely perceived as self-corrupt, as corrupt and self-serving as its rhetorical and in many cases physical punching bag, the Islamic State poses as the liberator of the masses from business as usual. And here, at least for me, it became difficult to tell the story while remaining within the boundaries of Islamic studies. Indeed, if the Islamic State's call to reject the learned opinions of an expert class has a familiar ring to it, that is because it exemplifies a form of right-wing populism that is everywhere ascendant, and that often manifests as a critique of knowledge rather than a critique of power structures. Indeed, the problem with power is that it's not sufficiently concentrated in the proper hands. Right-wing populists therefore aim not at the democratization of power or the deconstruction of privilege, but the replacement of an entrenched elite with a new and even more autocratic one. And disdain for expertise in the kind of elite class that lays claim to it is baked into this pie. So the second example that I prepared for tonight has to do with the use of violence. After kind of recent suicide attack at the airport in Kabul, kind of commentators again trotted out these old questions about why it was that Muslims supposedly couldn't accommodate themselves to the modern world, as if suicide bombing was a time-honored Islamic principle. Right. But again, here history can be a crutch. The truth is that this tactic only emerged within Islamic organizations in the 1980s and in the very specific context of the occupation of Beirut. From a Sunni theological perspective, one could make the case that the pursuit of one's own death is highly problematic because of the prohibition on suicide. And moreover, particularly when carried out against targets in the West, these sorts of attacks have another essential characteristic. They advance a little in the way of some sort of grand strategic end, but they are tremendously successful as forms of spectacle. And one of the things I kind of will hope that we'll be able to get into and talk tonight is how we should think about this kind of question of ends and means in this world that is so kind of mediated by spectacle. So moreover, right, these new forms of violence and spectacular violence in the most literal sense exist in this relationship of codependence with the media channels that cover them and really facilitate them. It is tragic in ethical terms if one executes a hostage in the Syrian desert, but it accomplishes very little if that video cannot be shared and watched the whole world over. Suicide attacks and on-screen executions are indeed tailor-made for a world with instantaneous communication networks, 24/7 news cycle, and globalized social media. And so too, the profit model of capitalist journalism incentivized sensational coverage. So far from being anything essential to Islam, we find instead that militants rely on forms of spectacular violence that are themselves only a few decades old and fully depend on the most modern of media to amplify their effects the world over. I'll kind of leave us with like one final example of this kind of that speaks to this question of violence and spectacle, which is that, right, these on-screen executions are associated with this like huge level of gore, particularly when done by the Islamic State. But that's not the only type of spectacular violence that's on display, I would argue. I'm going to, hold on. Let me just make sure I have it all queued up for you. I'm going to share my screen just for a moment to show you another way that this might manifest. Can we see this? This little infographic right here. This is a kind of chart taken from Al-Naba, which is the Islamic State's Arabic language newsletter, which has been pretty much kind of published on a weekly basis since 2015. I know most of us don't read Arabic here, but this essentially is an accounting of various attacks undertaken in different provinces in both Iraq and in Syria, the nature of the attacks, the type of attacks, the kind of who was killed and in which ones, like the different regions in which these attacks were undertaken. So just absorb this infographic for a second and try to place that in your mind somewhere alongside what you might more commonly think about as the kind of Islamic State media. Okay. When I first encountered this, it really did spur a, what am I seeing here? Like, right, what type of like apocalyptic religious militants if we're supposed kind of to believe the dominant characterization of them, feels compelled to issue these sort of progress reports, which tells people how they've been doing, and with incredible amounts of precision. Right? This is not like the old tactic of just claiming that, you know, thousands and thousands of people were killed and thousands are wounded. Oh, no, they're aiming for precision here. This is really sober journalism for a kind of a jihadi set. And we would search the records of, you know, right, pre-modern kind of Islamic conquerors in vain to find anything that resembles this type of reporting style. What does this look like? Well, on the other hand, really what it seems to look like is the periodic updates issued by many NGOs or corporations or even government agencies, right? This year we did X, we did Y, we served this many participants in this many cities, right? There's this very uncanny kind of mundane aspect of serving data in this fashion. That kind of gestures at the fact that in this world obsessed with statistics and outcomes, right, this type of reporting strategy is key for organizations seeking to justify their existence by recourse to some sort of market-based thinking. We all must account for ourselves in some way. And in this sense, the Islamic State is fully keeping with the times. So I said I could go on and offer like myriad other examples, but I think I'm going to pause here just because I've already put a bunch on the table and given you some again, some kind of examples from the book that we can maybe think about as well. So I'm going to I'm going to stop talking and kick it over to Murtaza for his first response.
Yeah, that was excellent comment, Suzanne. You know, it's interesting you make the point about, it's a very simple point, but it's deceptively important. It's, you know, why things are today that the way they were not several decades ago. And you can say hundreds of years ago too. There was, you know, people's behavior, people's interpretation of religion, the manner in which people engage in politics and violence was quite different. There's a very interesting anecdote that is in Steve Cole's book Ghost Wars about the pre 9/11 war in Afghanistan and other Middle Eastern countries that led up to 9/11. It came from the 80s when the U.S. was helping support the Afghan Mujahideen in fighting the Soviet Union and the Soviet puppet regime in Afghanistan. And CIA operations officers wanted to bomb the Salang Tunnel, which is a very long tunnel of strategic importance that was used for shipping military goods and so forth to the Soviet-backed government. And they needed someone, it was a suicide mission. So they need somebody to be willing to blow themselves up because the depth of the tunnel was such that it would have been, there'd be no way out. You can no way to plant a bomb and escape, or it'd be too risky, the operation be found out. So they contacted their local Mujahideen groups they supported, and they found that they could not find a volunteer for the mission. And the reason is because the Mujahideen were very religious, and they said that, well, we can't commit suicide because it's against our religion. And this was about 40 years ago. And then now, just a few weeks ago, you see this attack at the Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul, a suicide attack in the same country, the descendants of the same people. And only a few generations later, the understanding has completely switched. And whereas before it was extremely normative and still is normative to the vast majority of people that if you're a Muslim, you cannot commit suicide, you cannot give your life or take your life willingly. Only God can take your life. Your life is determined by fate. You can't take it in your own hands in that sense. But now it's become almost it's considered a stereotype that people have that perspective, that they can do that they do that all the time. And there's been a profound shift, as you can see, emblematized by that, even in Afghanistan and elsewhere. The thing is just very, very important, and it's like a baseline thing to understand. And it's kind of interesting that even people don't understand this, but there's no part of the world which is untouched by modernity, or there's very few parts of the world, and the Middle East certainly has not been untouched by modernity. But the Middle East, people say, when will the Muslim world modernize? When will they have a reformation? What's happening right now is the modernization and is the reformation, and these terrorist groups are a byproduct of that which took place, or even in some sense, political Islam was the primary product of the reformation as it took place in the Muslim world. Because as you mentioned, Suzanne, historically there were traditional authorities in these countries which had great legitimacy, and the last classical jihad which is declared was the Ottoman Empire's jihad against with the Entente powers in World War I. So on behalf of Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire, which is now reduced to Turkey. But that was a traditionally legally accepted jihad. It was something like, it could only be declared by a ruler, and it was like a religious justification or primatur of authority on top of a war, like something like just war, for instance, just war theory, bearing upon that to some degree. The idea that an individual could do that themselves was unheard of. The idea that people could do their own forms of non-state violence and call it jihad had no precedent in history. And in fact, a violence which was not sanctioned by ruling authorities or temporal authorities, you could say, was almost de facto considered illegitimate. So, after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, that was the last caliphate. Actually, that was the last seat of the caliphate was dissolved at the end of World War I by Ataturk and the establishment of the Turkish Republic. And since then, there's not been any temporal authority which can claim to speak for all Muslims, and thus no one can declare a jihad anymore. That doesn't exist anymore. Of course, that's past the time. But what that really meant is it was a time of profound confusion, and the last century has been just profound confusion on behalf of everyone in the world, not just Muslims, but I'm sure that everyone in the United States is very confused and disoriented by the events of the last 10 years or 20 years or whatever you want to say. But very much so, it was a very traumatic and wrenching time in Muslim majority countries, specifically because you had the dissolution of these old certainties and these old political forms. You had, for the first century, you had deep subjugation and humiliation by outside powers, and then the last half of the century and to this day, you have this very bitter conflict between ruling regimes, often military in nature, and which you could say is their opposition, which comprised everything from liberals to leftists to Islamists. And in this confrontation, the ulema, the traditional clergy, such as it still exists, and I give the best example is perhaps in Egypt, where the Al-Azhar is based and was traditionally the most important center of Sunni Islamic scholarship in the world. The ruling clergy has been completely co-opted since the time of Nasser onwards by the Egyptian military. And they've become sort of hand in glove in legitimating military rule in Egypt. Now, if anyone's familiar with Egypt, that the military rule, especially today, is extremely brutal, extremely corrupt, extremely venal, very, very much in bed with the maintenance of an unjust social order or social order which is exclusionary to many people. And it's galvanized in opposition to it all array of people. In 2011, you saw leftists and liberals and Islamists all being against it. And today, it's hegemonic. It's still supported by the ulama, by Al-Azhar. What the byproduct of that is, Al-Azhar is delegitimized in the eyes of most people, because if the traditional clergy are now supporting a regime which engages in torture, which engages in all forms of murder and sexual violence and corruption, then people are it's inevitable that they're going to be turning against it. And one key thing to note as well too is that if you look at the lineage intellectually of modern Islamist groups, the progenitors of them, or the people who they got their start with, similar somewhat to the gentleman that you mentioned, Suzanne, in England, the Bengali British guy who wrote that in ISIS, they were not people who were trained in Islamic scholarship. Like Sayyid Qutb was a liberal novelist. Muhammad Maududi, who was a Pakistani Islamist, he was a journalist. And this is very, very common because they had ideas they were secular born, in a sense. They had very secular backgrounds, secular upbringings, and they took Islamic ideas, or they tried to add revolutionary, to put it another way, look, like in the 20th century, Muslim majority countries were in a deep conflict with the West, and they had this wrenching experience with the West. And Westerners had these very seemingly powerful and robust ideologies. They had fascism, they had communism, they had anarchism, and in the Muslim countries, they didn't have any of that. They had their religion, which is basically the fabric of their life, and they did not have sophisticated politics. And the idea, which seemed very logical at the time, was that if Westerners who are so powerful have these ideologies, revolutionary, ideologies of mass movements and so forth, we need that too. But we need something which fits our identity too. It should be an Islamic version of that, or Islamic response to that. So these tactics of ISIS and Al-Qaeda before them and many other groups, these terrorist tactics, these tactics of individual stochastic violence, and permutated even in attacks of military targets or civilian targets, they're very inspired by 19th century anarchist violence, leftist violence. Al-Qaeda conceived themselves as a vanguard, a revolutionary vanguard, using violence to reshape society. There's a very important text called the the Management of Savagery, and it's an Al-Qaeda text, and it talks about, if you're familiar with the term accelerationism, it talks about how to use accelerationism for the purpose of fighting these regimes in Muslim countries. So the Management of Savagery counts. It says specifically that if you're looking for Islam or jihad has nothing to do with that in a sense. It's looking for something really, it's all fighting and all suffering. So forget your Islam at the door, that type of thing. It was very prioritizing the political mission above what you would say as an immutable law, which people saw Islam as before, and subjugating to that. And it said that the only way we can defeat these regimes, which are undeniably very entrenched and brutal regimes, and anyone who's looking for a way to fight them, is to create these zones of chaos and violence and disorder. Whereas Islam historically has been a very conservative force in the sense that it's all about the maintenance of order. And it says if life isn't perfect, you still have the afterlife. So let's not let's not roll the dice or have revolutionary movements. It's very skeptical of revolutions. These guys are all about revolutions. They're all about revolutions and revolutionary violence and subjugating Islam per se, as it traditionally understood, to their political mission. The last thing I'll say about this, and the most resonant example of it, and it would really struck me because I used to read Suzanne also all the ISIS propaganda when it was coming out of the magazines for research purposes, obviously. But they would put the state above anything else. The state was their god basically, and anything that you did was justified if it's for the state, because we have to establish a state. We're Muslims. We need a state, and they specifically said there was a lot of controversy around some of the things they did, like burning the Jordanian pilot. It's very interesting because in the Quran it specifically prohibits cruel forms of murder, including by name. It mentions burning people. It's considered even warfare. You're not allowed to do that, and they did specifically that, and they justify it by saying, well, the state needed it, and the state required us to take extreme steps, and we're going to continue doing that. So, but by deduction, what they're saying is their God is really the state, because if the state is the ultimate determinant of your actions and what you deem as legitimate, then you set that up as the guiding light and your deity, that's your North Star for your behavior. So, they're truly extremely modern, and they would not be recognized by traditional Islamic scholarship or history, because for two reasons. For one, they could never have existed prior to that because the technological context was not such that it would produce that. And not go on and on, but part of it also is because of people are mass literacy, and mass literacy is a good thing in some ways, but mass literacy also is a emancipation of interpretation to many people. Whereas before, maybe some sector of society was highly literate, most people were not. They didn't need to be. And the people who were, they were specifically tasked with fulfilling a certain role in society, which was, interpreting the law, whether it's Islamic law or, the law of the sultans or property law, whatever it is. Now with mass literacy, these very literate classes of people who first actually were liberals, like Sayyid Qutb, they started reading, interpreting, drawing their own conclusions. And it's really hard the Protestantization of Islam, as you mentioned, Susie, it's very related to the mass literacy, the advent of mass literacy in these countries. And does not mean that the necessary outcome of mass literacy among people in Muslim majority countries is, violence, but it means that in a situation where the political conditions are conducive to violence anyways, you will find people articulating revolutionary and violent ideologies in an idiom which makes sense based on their history and cultural context. And I would even say their emotional needs. People want to emotionally feel that they have not broken with the past. And just like in far right movements in the West, a lot of the angst and a lot of the anger comes from the sense of losing their identity. A similar thing is in Muslim countries as well too. They feel they're losing identity, and all the more reason. You can only be a fanatic or fundamentalist when you feel that what you believe in or what you are is slipping away in some sense. You have to have a different sort of acceptance and peace if you don't feel that. But yeah, the sum total is though that these movements are very modern, and they cannot be otherwise but modern because they come out of the modern world, which includes the Middle East and the greater Middle East.
Thank you so much, Murtaza. And just sort of at this halfway mark, I want to remind people who are watching and listening that you can drop questions and comments that we'll try to get to in a little bit in the chat channel on the Facebook Live. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Patrick.
Thanks. It's fantastic to be here today, and particularly wonderful to be celebrating Susie's just brilliant book, which I can't sing the praises of enough, and I really want to commend to everyone who's watching this yet again. Buy it. If only for those graphics, they're amazing. I love like the Dabiq org charts and stuff. It's eerie, and it makes so much mileage proving the points that you also so eruditely lay out. And it's also really excellent to be talking in the company of Murtaza and you, Ajay, as well. So thank you. It's an honor. I've been thinking about the book now, read it twice, and I think it was so hard I found myself thinking of it involuntarily even before the second reread, when I was watching the footage that was coming out of Afghanistan, right? And specifically the social media accounts loosely affiliated supposedly with the incoming Taliban regime that were showing fighters in the process of entering abandoned US bases, and going through office buildings, foreign embassies, etc., but also doing things like just standing around or getting into cars or essentially mugging for the camera. And the thing that was so striking about this was and I think multiple people observed this, was the gear that they were wearing and the way that the photos were staged. And it, both, as technical military people, like all those like heads will tell you, like you could tell some of them had actually been trained by US forces insofar as the way they were holding their fingers on the triggers, etc. But also just the broader aesthetics of the tactical gear, of the particular types of brands, and specifically to see 511, which is a well-known US, started out as a mountaineering firm, then became tactical apparel for like operator types, and then finally now you can find in local malls where they still sell tactical gear, but also backpacks and other things. But to see Taliban, essentially special forces, geared up like, I don't know, like their American equivalents, but also like open carry protesters or players like Call of Duty skins. In other words, wearing like the hallmarks of this homogenized, badass operator gear, even as they were themselves helping themselves to small arms and other material that the US had left behind, was I think an eerie illustration of the convergences, aesthetic and structural, that you get at in your book. And I think I will say too, you can find some pictures of Qasem Soleimani wearing 511. Apparently he had a 511 baseball cap that he'd wear all over the place. They're made, lots of them are made in Central Asia, so they disperse. But there was something about those images that I was thinking about in relation to your book, both on the level of aesthetics and the way in which like what that gear signifies, right, is the ability to, and I'm going to just like throw a lot of this rhetoric that these people use like for this stuff, like, but like you can be you engage in kinetic operations, you're extremely fast, you're placed, like these are the things that badasses wear and use when they're dropped into a hostile environment, and then they can operate, hence the phrase operator, with minimal support. Right, it's all strapped onto them, and they're all high-speed, low drag, and all this other bullshit. And so that's like aesthetically there. And I think as your book very remarkably articulates, there's some like real thematics of like masculinity and just sort of like violence entrepreneurs who are always ready at a moment's notice for fighting on a battlefield that could be anywhere, right? But the other thing I was thinking about too was how on a more than aesthetic level, structurally, special forces groups, like their history, which is inextricable from the history of the War on Terror and from the US Empire's counterinsurgency operations, and then the French and British predecessors and ongoing contemporaries to that, is very much a story of institutions that operate at like a supra-state level, or independent of the state, or at least independent of clear lines of accountability, and that are also sort of part of broader ecosystems of private military corporations, but also of sort of soldiers of fortune who just travel from theater to theater and exist in that like revolving door world of arms industry and training and otherwise, just like general regime and destabilization purposes. And I think that there's something about that is, I think there's many profound truths that play in your book, but the one that really I'm struck with here is this way in which like, well, it comes back to legitimacy and questions of the state, as Murtaza was talking about, and as you were talking about earlier. Like I'm struck by how, and I think your book articulates this really well, the way in which I think we're living in a moment where sovereignty is even as we have this language that associates sovereignty with the state and sees the state as the final arbiter of so many things, we also, and this is an example you get into, Susie, in your interview with Kaylee in The Revealer, right? We have a state that is not really functional. a state that you can count on maybe to get to take taxes from you, but it's not going to, I don't know, return your grandmother's sister's like medical calls, right? There's no, like, the institutions are not there. So on the one hand, like, our experience of the actual state as just people who live in it, right, and are seeking basic recourse or some degree of social safety net is there's no dependability, there's nothing, it's static, it's sclerotic, it's collapsing, it's undependable. But meanwhile, the state itself, through an ecosystem of parastate entities, is deploying these frictionless killers who are so incredibly badass, right? And they aren't members, and are like entities like SOCOM or the other things, like, do they respond to the executive? Do they respond? Who exactly? Mapping out the org charts for this is a kind of is both inevitably part of it, but also kind of an exercise in realizing how, like, fluid these things are. And I think, like, where that left me was thinking about how a lot of the frameworks for analysis that you look at and the futures that you sketch out they map onto a lot of other circumstances too. And the other example I was thinking of here, just with an eye towards, like, the management of savagery, but also just the weirdness of the fact that, I think we should sit with it for a second, that like Taliban forces, insurgent forces who were victorious in ousting a national, like, occupier, already have their own counterinsurgency special forces. Like, what exactly is a necessity for that, unless there's something about this idea of, like, well, performing this badassness, but that, well, that's what the state does. The state has badass guys that they deploy to repress people, right? And I think that that's more than aesthetic. That, again, that speaks like material infrastructural connections. And the other analogy I was thinking of here in relation to this, based upon your book, is the situation in Mexico, right? Or particularly in the past 20 years. And I think that these are real, just to, like, to spread this, to unpack that for people. And I'm drawing on the work of Joan Grillo and Carmen Bolusas, who've written some really good books about this. But the ways in which, well, what people talk about, what we were going to talk, if we talk about the Mexican War as either, like, I think civil war isn't quite accurate. The drug war certainly is also an ideologically framed thing. But if we take we take what's happening south of the border, but also crossing the border, as a multi-directional, ongoing conflict with massive human losses that implicates two states, the U.S. and Mexico at minimum, but also different infrastructural entities within those states, because we're no longer in their own unitary states, but also actors like what we call cartels, but cartel isn't even the right word insofar as Grillo and Bolusas unpack. The story of cartels' emergence is the story actually of big cartels being broken up during the era of neoliberalism, and essentially commoditized violence work being something that individual entrepreneurs, many of whom are themselves special forces, whether trained by the US or just, you know, from the Mexican GAFE, seeking essentially to make their own bids to control resources, but also to arrive at a certain type of legitimacy, right? That is intimately bound up in one, like, providing parastate infrastructure, right? The ways in which the Taliban are still a sort of state, or the ISIS is very invested in a type of parastate formation, or maintaining types of flows of extractions, be they artifacts or natural resources or drugs. I'll talk about a through line there, right? It's not like individuals, it's not like the Navy's, like, a lot of Navy SEALs have been deployed by the CIA to help drug traffickers move drugs. It's not like those units themselves have a problem with, like, moving drugs on a smaller scale too. But, like, this maps onto the Mexico and I think Afghanistan examples as well, insofar as that, well, it seems, and this gets at the point I was making earlier about this feeling inevitability of the turn towards the particular type of violence that is counterinsurgency, insofar as that, talk about another situation in Mexico where you have an escalation of theatrics of violence, right, as a way of claiming territory, as a way of showing that one has the power that one's enemies do not, and therefore one is in control, right? This thing about this is sort of a bald legitimacy, as sort of like it's legitimacy just through power. And I think just to wrap this out in terms of where I'm, what your book has really done for me is, to put it bluntly, like helping denature my natural tendency. I think a lot of our natural tendency to think in terms of the state, to always think that the state is a unitary thing, that the state is does simple things like declare war and then undeclare war, go in and out. Of course, I mean, our actual experience in the past 2 decades shows that it does much more than that. But to really think about violence brokers, to use another language, right, or violence entrepreneurs, operate sometimes in conflict with one another, but other times in strange partnerships, right, to basically to ensure an ongoing flow, not just of resources, but also of a homeostatic insecurity, right? And I think that sort of, as you close the book with, that sort of way in which the security paradigm produces constantly the need for the experience of insecurity or the threat of insecurity, the better to, further those flows, but also to underwrite this basic ongoing churn of human disposability. That I think it just, I don't know, I guess what I'm saying is that your analytic has so many legs for me. It seems to move, it seems to have cash value in a lot of different directions for perceiving everything from local quote unquote conflicts to the ways in which we formulate things like civil war, right? Or contests over legitimacy. I have questions for you. I want to talk to you about like a bit about defunding this in the book, but look, I could go on for a long time. What I'm basically saying is that the book is brilliant. People should buy it. Please buy our book.
Nice punctum. So it's very exciting to be talking about this book with Susie and with Murtaza and Pat. For me in particular, I have to say, just because I've seen this book in different forms and different bits and pieces over the past many years, and we have it, you've presented parts of it at Brooklyn Institute research workshops and things like that. And in fact, you and I met however many years ago now, because we were both, when you were an undergrad working on some of these issues, and I was a PhD student working on also questions about Islamic politics, although my focus was more in the Shia world, which is like not something that is a big part of this book for very, very good reasons. It's really quite irrelevant for this story. But I think I want to start these comments. And yeah, the other thing I'll say is that some of the ideas, Murtaza mentioned this sort of reformation, and it comes up in your book as well. And this is, again, one of these like ticks of the sort of, like, I'd say liberal media, right? It's like, oh, when's that good old Islamic Reformation, Protestant Reformation coming? And it's like, that was called Wahhabism. Like it's ongoing. I also often wonder when people ask things like that, if they are very aware of like what the history of the like wars of religion were like in Europe. Like it was like hundreds of years of turmoil. And in fact, in one version of the nation state story that in fact Pat was just sort of walking us into, right? It is that is the thing invented to put a kibosh on the violence of the Reformation. But nonetheless, I want to sort of bring us back, and maybe I think Murtaza and Patrick have done so well in delineating some of the sort of immediate contexts and some of the immediate sort of analogs, that what I want to do is sort of draw out some of the broadest themes. This is a very political theory move, I apologize. And one of them, I will though begin exactly where Murtaza did, which is that no part of the world, I'm just quoting you, right, is untouched by modernity. And I would say that I will amp up the volume a little bit and say no part of the world is untouched by capitalism. And that is literally true. I mean, especially if you get into areas that really interest me, like climate and stuff like this, like literally there's no part of the world that has not been touched by capitalism. And so when we are talking about, and I think we haven't really gotten into this that much, and maybe Susie will get a chance to talk about it more in a moment, some of the parallels that Susie starts to draw, right, between jihadi violence in a case like ISIS, or jihadis who are drawn to ISIS, and for example, mass spectacular like shootings in the United States. We are looking at, right, similar phenomena developing on very different terrains, very uneven, right, uneven and combined development up the wazoo here, right, but that are exhibiting some remarkably similar qualities. And this leads, so that's sort of like theme number one in a way, I would say, like our biggest theme. And then in that, I'd say the next thing that is probably going to be most surprising to a lot of readers of this book is the way in which organizations like ISIS, organizations like Al-Qaeda, and Murtaza mentioned this as well, they're not modeled on, like there's not like some, like medieval or golden age of Islam or whatever you want to say, sort of like model for this stuff. I forget it reminds me of that scene in The Wire. There's it's been a long time since I read Faisal Devji's Landscapes of the Jihad, which parts of your book really reminded me of, and also like sort of developed his themes so well, so much further. But there's a part where like American soldiers are like going through some abandoned Al-Qaeda like base or whatever, and you know they're expecting, I guess, to find like Ibn Taymiyyah like documents and shit like this, and what do they find is like business manuals and like how to effectively manage your corporation, you know, all this kind of shit. There's like MBA stuff, and it reminds me of that scene in The Wire where they go into, I forget his name, the character's name, this is embarrassing, but you know, that sort of drug dealer. Yeah, Stringer Bell. They go into his apartment, and you know they're expecting, I don't know what they're expecting to find, some kind of like drug dealer bullshit, some, you know, some racist you know, projection of what they think a drug dealer thinks like. And what do they find is like a copy of Adam Smith and several modern economics textbooks. And they're like, who the hell have we been fighting here? And I think that is really a wonderful sort of way of getting into how these are fundamentally modern things. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with changing things, right? And this is actually one of the things I hope you get a chance to talk about more, Suze, right? The sort of this very idea of tradition as this like unending thing that is sort of timeless, that's invented by modern scholars too, right? These things were never transhistorical. They were never fixed and static. And I think from there, we get into maybe some of the places that you're really, really far out towards the end, which I also find very germane. Like, for example, the way in which apocalypticism, right, can be kind of arresting, right? I think people, or even like desirable, if you live in a world without change that seems to be going very badly. And this is one of those things that I think is very, very important for people who are reading this book and thinking about this right now, especially about these parallels, is that to all these people, things seem to be, and this is pretty empirical, things are going quite poorly. And thus, the idea of the apocalypse is some kind of escape hatch from there. Can be an impediment to like maybe like a real politics, to like a capital P politics, let's say. Real politics, I'm sort of stealing from Raymond Geuss, and capital P from Zygmunt Bauman. And then finally, a theme that to me is something that's very close to my heart, as you know, Susie, and I've written about this for a long time, and something that I think about all the time, is the way in which neoliberalism is kind of the reflection of, it's not even almost the boomerang model as with Césaire or something like that, but it is kind of almost like we have the spread of the colonial relation, or a more colonial relation back home. And that's actually what neoliberalism is. It's like the neo-colonialism of home. And that gets us into dysfunctional states and all this stuff. COVID was the perfect theater for this, right? What was the most functional state in the world during COVID? It was like Vietnam. What was the least functional state? Yeah, probably maybe the US, but Europe wasn't so hot either. Canada, these like all these global wealthy powerhouses like actually sucked completely. And it was these like supposedly dated post-communist or whatever you want, like communist run regimes and like developmental states like South Korea and Taiwan that like did really well, right? So we're like come up with all these weird conundrums. And I think this is where I have like a series of questions that I hope maybe you get to address. So like first, I think this question, and I know you know that you've read me on this, so you know this question is coming. Like, and I think Pat was touching on this as well, right? Like state, not state. There's just so much more than state, not state, right? Right. And we need better language than this. In my own work, I often talk about states and different kinds of states, different kinds of non-states, different kinds of state actors, different kinds of non-state actors. You lean pretty heavily on the Weber sort of, you know, monopoly of violence stuff, you know, right, which he takes, if I recall correctly, from Trotsky. Right, so it's like there's like a really weird sort of interplay on who's defining the state, and I have to say, like, I don't even like to say the state. It actually bothers me. Like to say that the United States and China and Saudi Arabia and Sudan are all the same thing. That just doesn't seem true to me. Like or even varieties of the same thing. It seems untrue to me. But I'll leave that as a question, not as a comment. The second one is about the one of the ideas that comes through so well, I think, of when you're discussing Western violence, and here maybe Pat can also speak to this as well, is this kind of nihilism, like violence is the point of the violence. Right. And if you think of the sort of classic mass shooting models, I know, Patrick, you're always trying to trouble this, right? But the sort of Adam Lanzas of the world and things like that, right? That is the point. Like there's no, and Susie has a wonderful line in the book where she's like, there's no demands, right? Like there's no like list of like release the following 6 prisoners and like give me the sovereign territory of X, Y, and Z, right? Like it's just, I'm here to kill some folks. And I wonder how well this, or how this applies. So you draw this to the ISIS model, and it does seem that rhetorically they sometimes play with this. But you know, to quote another pop culture reference, I'm sorry to be that guy, but it's like the Big Lebowski. It's like, say what you will about the tenets of National Socialism. At least it's an ethos. But it's like, say what you will about the tenets of the Islamic State. They seem to have an ideology, right? They seem to have one. They seem to have things they want. Now, their rhetoric and their mediation and the psychology that they employ and the spectacle they employ may be more nihilistic. And I think this is where maybe some of Patrick, some of your comments about aesthetics come in, and some of what Murtaza was talking about, which will actually lead me to my next point, which is this question of sort of violence and legitimacy. Right, like Murtaza mentioned, right, when Al-Qaeda or a group like that is writing about revolutionary violence, right, they're modeling themselves as a vanguard. They're modeling themselves on Western, not just Western models, but frankly, on some of my favorite leftist models, right? And you talk about this as well. They're drawing from Che, they're drawing from Mao. They'll cite accelerationism, like in that classic sense. They'll do all this stuff, and I think there is a real question about about non-state, the legitimacy and the necessity in some cases of non-state violence. And here I'll cite sort of my principal case study area, which is, climate violence, like climate change, climate violence, climate politics. Like I feel like almost every serious version of climate politics at this point. Andreas Malm just put out a book not too long ago, also from Verso, I believe, called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. It does not actually tell you how to blow up a pipeline, but it does sort of make the case that part of the politics of climate change is absolutely going to be state oriented, but part of it is not. Part of it is going to probably involve some pretty unsavory shit, certainly towards property. I would probably extend that and say probably it's going to be nastier than we want to hope. And this kind of thing about eco-terrorism, guerrilla warfare, I know it's close to your heart as well because of your history in studying anti-colonial and post-colonial history. And right, that is how so many of these changes happen. So the question is, where do we draw those lines, or are we drawing those lines? And then I have some really dicey sort of questions that come out of the parallel. And again, you've heard some of this before, so have at it. About this question of homogeneity and pluralism versus heterogeneity and all this kind of stuff. Because obviously ISIS, as the case study, right, they want homogeneity. Of course, this is, I can give a million examples of sort of, ethnic homogeneity, religious homogeneity, et cetera, cultural homogeneity. The jump to political heterogeneity, right, is a really interesting one to me. Because of course, almost all emancipatory movements are not politically heterogeneous. And again, I'll use the climate case as my example, right? Like, it's not just that I would hope to win in the war of ideas that fossil fuels are bad or extractivism is terrible. I would want those ideas dead, buried, policed, and destroyed, and the people who want to advance them to be defanged or worse, right? So that is not heterogeneous, it's homogeneous. And these are the kinds of questions. First of all, everyone should read this book, especially if you need an introduction to some of these kinds of questions, and also like a crash course in just how ahistorical so many takes on Islam in the Middle East and political Islam, Middle Islamism, however you want to term it, are. Susie walks you briskly through this stuff and explains it clearly. And then it opens the door to all of these kinds of questions that all three of us have been posing, and that now I guess I will just hand it right back over to you, Suze. And I will encourage everyone also again to pick up a copy of The Apocalypse and the End of History.
Thank you. Thanks. I mean, thank you all of you for these amazing comments. I have I don't know why the only paper I could find in this house.
Oh no!
Notes. But I have a whole series of them laid out before me with different questions and things I might want to speak to in one way or another. And I'm not going to probably be able to do everything, but I guess maybe just kind of trying to go a tiny bit in order. Murtaza, you brought up the real like historical anomaly of like suicide bombing even within Islam, and how difficult it was to like find someone to do these missions even like 40 years ago, and that now this has been assumed to be this like time-honored principle that stretches back eternally. And I think that something that's so fascinating here is that this speaks to the ways in which religions are embedded like historical objects. They evolve. Even the ideology is not static, right? So right now there is a whole swath of ideology justifying kind of suicide missions. They'll talk about kind of the pursuit of one's own death as really like the highest form of kind of life almost, right? And this kind of and what one should pursue. I'm going to just read a little quote here, which I think actually ties in a lot of all three of your comments in some ways, right? This is from a kind of Islamic State kind of magazine, where they say the objective of hostage taking in the lands of disbelief, and specifically in relation to just terror operations, is not to hold large members of the disbelievers hostage in order to negotiate one's demands. Right? This is not what we're interested in. Rather, the objective is to create as much carnage and terror as possible, as one possibly can, until Allah decrees his appointed time and the enemies of Allah storm his location or succeed in killing him. Right? This is not the same even universe of Islam that existed 40 or 50 years ago. It's and I think people have like really hard time thinking about religions as like historically changing and evolving phenomenon. Like they think that means that you're like assaulting their divinity or their sanctity or something like that, and that's not necessarily the case. It just is to say that these are phenomena that are social and material embedded, and they change over time. And the ideologies, and which is right, this is like this old like face off between kind of people who center ideology as the primary moving factor here versus like material conditions. And we actually can kind of get beyond that and say like, well, actually the ideologies themselves shift and change in response to these material conditions. Yeah. And then they're, only even a few decades old. And then they get projected onto the past by these groups, again, who claim the mantle of tradition, right? Nothing more modern than claiming oneself to be traditional, right? Then as this kind of just pure expression of all that came before. And the other thing that Murtaza, I was thinking about when you were kind of talking is that this, right, these kind of like the crisis of legitimacy that I ultimately kind of trace this like, right, evolution of jihad from a kind of tool of the state to an insurgent tactic, right? And really, you mentioned Egypt, which is kind of the heartland of this with through a figure like Sayyid Qutb, that the, right, like the I'm still kind of said this is not fully thought out in my mind yet, but right, what is the nature of the opposition to these kind of governments? Well, like Anwar Sadat comes to power promising to kind of undo many of the Nasser socialist kind of advances, and specifically promotes Islamist parties and Islamist kind of student gatherings, etc., as a counterweight to the left. And guess what? That's a project that America is also really happy to get on board with. And the idea that kind of supporting Islamism and Islamist groups and resurgence as this counterweight to the left, I think is like a really important one that we can see kind of play out in a variety of theaters. And that also when we want to just like socially explain why is it that, kind of militant like Islamist groups kind of come to be the if not the sole, then certainly some of the dominant kind of opposition players in many of these countries. Well, because we're living in an age in which there is no alternative. And this, my friends, is the only alternative that was on offer. But really getting there and telling that story kind of embeds us in these like networks of imperial power. And it's kind of hard to tell the story as to how that developed without kind of paying attention to support for a particular type of religious politics as a perceived counterweight to the left. Okay, hold on. I have more post-it notes. Hold on. I have a fun graphic about accelerationism, but it's in the book. You can find it there. But there's literally like a flow chart where they're like, are the steps. This is how it works. The other thing, Murtaza, I wanted to just comment on is that yes, the state is essential in this telling, which is something that really differentiates the Islamic State from Al-Qaeda. Right, who does not attempt to kind of erect a parallel political community, right? They are these elite vanguard, but they are not themselves kind of, they don't try to erect a caliphate. They do not try to govern. And that this attempt to kind of reroute jihad and the authority of the state is quite important here. And it really, like, to read a lot of this literature, you realize that like they're really good Hegelians. Like they really believe that the state is the divine will on earth, and that your role as an individual is to bring yourself into alignment with the will of the state. That is kind of, what is prescribed for you. And I'm not like making this up when I say that they're good Hegelians. Like literally much of this thinking about kind of Islamism in the state comes through people like Maududi, who like explicitly wrote about Hegel and Hegel's view of the state. Like the intellectual genealogy here is not actually kind of that complicated. And the other interesting thing is that, right, that the state has to impose in these like modern, in the kind of Islamic State caliphate version of this, the state has to impose a type of religiosity that the population views as foreign or kind of oppositional. It's not that religiosity is kind of like a feature of the community that the state functions as a kind of to preserve, but rather the state itself has to kind of enforce that in this kind of top-down way. I think that this is really, really novel. And again, makes a lot more sense to think about alongside other kind of applications of contemporary state power than it does like right, a medieval caliphate or something like that. I'm just trying to watch our time because I know we're trying to not go too super deep, but Pat and Ajay, to kind of just also pick up on kind of keeping here with the state here, right? Like there is this yes, so as much as certainly like a group of like the Islamic State will kind of idealize the state in its directives, the form of them, it's not a state form, right? It's like a multinational corporation form.
Yeah.
Where you have your branches and your franchises the world over, and everyone is kind of linked together through kind of global media. Again, I refer to this as kind of like they're nowhere sovereign, but everywhere existent.
They're a franchise.
Right. This is kind of distributed, this distributed model. And this is one of the reasons why I talk about this not as like some sort of weird past, but as like a potential future, because what you see is the kind of breaking apart of political identity with even geography, like geographic territory, right? Like geography and identity no longer even have to kind of coincide in any sort of loose sense, but there is this potential that, right, one can be a soldier of the caliphate from wherever one exists in kind of, all around the world in the same way that, yeah, one might like take part in a fan club, or maybe even like more on the nose, like listen to orders that are being issued to you from like corporate headquarters, wherever they may be. And I do think it's really important to kind of think about the variety of ways in which like political actors can be non-states, even those that claim to be states, right? Even like the category of like non-state actors is huge and encompasses a lot of different groups that wield, quasi-sovereign sometimes, or like real sovereign power. Like, again, just like draw on like another example here, but like, where I teach just like oil politics class for Brooklyn Institute. And we talk about the case of Nigeria in some depth. Is Nigeria really a sovereign state? I think one could make an argument that Nigeria is a state form that exists to serve the interests of Royal Dutch Shell, and that has been its historic kind of use, and to prevent kind of democratic demands from being exercised against what that kind of against essentially oil companies and the kind of vast environmental and social degradation that they have kind of caused through state violence. We should add, of course, that many of these like police officers and army officials who are in charge of enacting this violence are themselves beneficiaries of American training through the War on Terror, right? So like how are we supposed to think about this? Like where are the boundaries between the sovereign state, the non-sovereign state, state actors, non-state actors, like who's like the primary wielder of violence? I don't have like a clear answer to this, only that it seems to me that we need to think about we need to think about forms of democratic power that would be matched for this type of sovereignty, or that is emerging, right? Where I mean sovereignty in like a broad sense, where not just the state is wielding sovereignty, but many other actors are becoming sovereign entities as well. And it seems like it is a hindrance for us in terms of like our kind of political thinking, if we're still thinking about democratic power as something that's tied to the institution of the state.
Yeah.
Because then it cannot contain the violence that comes from these actors that are not states. There's like a mismatch of some sort. Again, I don't have like a clear answer as to what has to happen here, but it is clear that like something like really elemental is happening in terms of who is a recognized wielder of violence, and that if you were interested in restraining violence or subjecting it to some sort of democratic control, we might also have to think beyond the state form itself.
Yeah.
I'm just like, Ajay, I'm looking at the time. I'm wondering if we can maybe take a few more. Do we have like other questions?
Oh yeah, there's audience questions for sure. If people want to respond, or if I don't know if people want to talk.
Yeah, do you want to do some? No, if anyone
Patrick,
wants
Murtaza, would you like audience questions, or you want to say anything in response to Suze or to each other, or to me?
No, I thought Suzanne's comments are great. It's very interesting. It's like there's something, I interviewed this guy once. He was a former Syrian, he was a political prisoner of the Assad regime, and he was a leftist, and he was imprisoned in the 80s, and he only got out in 2013 during the revolution, Yassin Haj Saleh. And he told me something very interesting. He was observing the emergence of the Syrian uprising at that time, and in 2013, he actually got in 2011, but in 2013, he saw the emergence of the Salafist groups, the Salafi jihadi groups against the regime. And although they came to dominate the revolution eventually, or the armed segment of the revolution, because they were the Darwinian fitness effect. They were the ones who were strong enough to survive the amount of violence going on in Syria at that time. So that you never saw anybody supporting them or thrilled about their arrival when they liberated an area from the government. People were against the regime, and these groups were against the regime, and there was a shared zone of interest for that reason. There was an opportunity for them for that reason. But it was not a jihadist uprising or a Salafist uprising by any means. The problem is that after the collapse of leftist movements globally, there's nobody else, there's no other game in town. If you want to fight the local regimes which are tyrannical or expressions of imperialism, wherever they're coming from, you either don't have an option, you can't do it, you have to just accommodate yourself to them, accommodate yourself potentially to injustice, or you can join these groups, Salafist groups or extremist groups, who actually are fighting these regimes. And unfortunately, what they want oftentimes not popular, not what people want, or create something worse. But that's what they fill a gap that exists. And until something else emerges to fill that gap, they're going to continue existing, because their existence is not predicated on a timeless ideology or people's atavistic religious beliefs. There's specific problems which exist, and until they're violent, serious problems, and they seem to call for a violent response because there's not really any other way of approaching them, they don't brook any other type of opposition. So they're going to continue existing, and there may be different types of groups. If you look back a few decades ago, there were leftist movements in Muslim majority countries which were armed, in Palestine and Iraq and elsewhere. There's another observation people used to make about Iraqis. Iraq was the most secular country in the Middle East, and Iraqis were stereotyped as being so secular. Even if you talk about Ayman al-Zawahiri's old writings, he's very skeptical of the idea of spreading Salafi jihadism in Iraq, because Iraqis were so secular. And then, after the war in Iraq, the U.S. war in Iraq, and the sectarian war that precipitated, and all those other calamities that emerged there, ISIS, theoretically, quote unquote, the most Islamist extremist group of all, it emerged out of Iraq, which is the most secular society in the Middle East as well too. And that seems to be not a coincidence. It's a relationship between the two things. And unfortunately, until something else emerges to fill the gap, I think these groups can still continue existing. But I also think people are tired of them. They're tired of them,
Yeah.
and I think that the calamities of the last 10 years are not going to be forgotten, or they're not going to pass without consequence.
Thank you. I know, Pat, you're on a sort of ticking clock. So I'm going to choose one of the questions from the audience that I think you and Suze, I think, can speak to the most here. Although me and Murtaza and me, feel free to. But Michael asks, most of what is being mentioned, I'm going to sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Fiddle with this a bit. It's manufactured by, or it's part of private military intelligence contractors and private military contractors, and many working alongside them within intelligence service in every nation. And this person is talking about, that part of this work is to make it appear natural, with the assistance of the sort of the mainstream mass media. So how does that sort of blanket or obscure the real problem? And I think, Suze, because this is a big part of your book, and Patrick, I know this is something that you talk about as well, and counterinsurgency is also like part of this weird story of the sort of Mao, Che, Lenin, like being adopted by the other side thing that happens in the neoliberals, and it happens with the counterinsurgencies too. So I wonder if we can address how this sort of PMCs and the intelligence community and the mass media sort of work together, sort of ideologically, I guess, is the first part of this person's question. And I think the second part is like, just say more about like, what is the role of PMCs, period. I'm adapting a little bit.
Do you want me to field that one first, or how did?
Oh, however you guys want. I'm sorry, I should have been more directive. Suze,
I'll fill in the gap.
Cool. I think what that question made me think of, and this bears on actually what Murtaza was just saying, and then what Susie you were saying prior, right? Is this question of well, that is, I'll say it simply, like, what is the state, right? Or what does it mean to think of something that's, as to answering the question of like, what does it mean to think of an alternative to the state, involves defining what the state is, right? And I think that there is this way, I think, to get at these examples, or like the sort of the murky waters that question gets at, right? Like when a reactionary regime seizes power against a democratically elected majority in some other country, and is this a like autochthonous desire for political change, or is it being fomented by state agents, et cetera? Like from here, who knows? But like in those murky waters, right, you find yourself asking questions like, well, what does a given state like want or intend in one of these moments, right? And or to give us to be very explicit about this, like, I can use a domestic U.S. example. Let's just say you're someone who believes, and I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to believe it. Let's say President Kennedy was killed by elements of the U.S. government, or there may have been involvement in that, right? Like, did a state do this when there are fissures within institutions within a state? When there are entities within a state that are operating on different timelines, or have different budgets or different systems of accountability, right? Then we start having to reach for rhetoric like, is there a deep state? Is there a parastate? Is there a administrative state? And all these are very freighted, right? But they get at this basic question of how do we understand, what are the limits of using this fairly hoary term, namely the state, to apply to institutions that are actually, I'll use a term from the 18th century, like a hierarchy, right? A multiple-headed kind of monster, which is a term that emerges from the birth of the transatlantic state, right? In the settler colonial, like U.S., the emergent British colonies, to refer to pirates, to specifically to the way that privateers self-organize, but also sometimes enjoy state legitimacy, essentially to steal, to pillage, to do all the things that a sovereign can do, namely attack another ship while flying a such and such a flag. In other words, right, at the beginning of the emergence of like the properly global Western colonial, neo-colonial, whatever state, you have this kind of fungibility between private and public power, but also a way in which the state emerges from the convergence of multiple entities that kind of constate it, so to speak, right? And where that like goes, I think, it produces a series of very strong states. But then in this later moment, when we go at the other end of the spectrum, we have the state essentially falling apart. And you have figures like Eric Prince being like, what the US government needs is a Dutch East India Company, right? Remember, like the Dutch East India Company, which could fly the British flag as though it were a state, right? When we have the state sort of deconsolidating, and you have, open questions like, is the U.S. assisting ISIS in certain theaters, but waging war against it in others? Like, what exactly? Or another question here, like, what is the state of Pakistan ultimately, at least insofar as it relates with like U.S. foreign policy in North Asia, right? Like, well, is it the ISI? Is it the government? Like, what? Again, the state ascribing agency or a strict set of causality to figures and players that we may never know. Like, I don't want to. It's undecidable, but the very fact that that's a question, I think, points to the way in which our rhetoric of the state or being wedded to the state is somewhat impoverished. And just, I think, to really drive this point home, this bears on the nihilism stuff, and I think of the Ray Planching question Murtaza asked about like what the alternative is or what will succeed this. I think at this latter moment, at this end of history moment, where the state basically is deconsolidating, the state is hollowing out, all the state has is that it's like the minimal expression of that Weberian principle. And I'm drawing on the work of an observation by a friend and interlocutor, Richard White, to this. But like, if your definition of the state is it can kill people and put to death,
and that's
at a
what it
certain
does.
point,
Yeah.
when institutions fall apart, right, the rest of the stuff like the income tax, the roads, fuck all that, at least the minimal form of the state is the killing, is the institutions of people that it hires to kill, are the people in uniforms who do the killing, right? And think about this for 1 second, like to think about this domestically too, like the way in which like all these calls to, in the wake of a plague, et cetera, to like reinvest in communities, et cetera, and defund the police. No, only people that are getting money are the police, right? The only thing that's non-negotiable every single year in a supposed like two-party system, right, where there are supposed to be differential options, is funding the military. Even as the state hollows out, all it does is institutionally invest in the institutions that give it that capacity to kill. That's it. And I think that this is the interesting convergence to think about these libidinal types of things with the appeal of an entity like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or any of these sort of violence brokers or like non-territorially like constrained entities, as you talk about in several of the chapters of your book, Susie, right? Where it's like, well, if all the state will ever do for you is let you die or worst kill you, right? Then there is a statement of profound individual agency and even a type of perverse community, and you're taking that right upon yourself, whether that be through family annihilation or an act of terror, right? There is a way in which what the individual does by engaging in individual violence at a mass casualty level is personalizing and seizing a type of power that makes them like a state, or that conjoins them with some other state where at least they can affirmatively define their affiliation with. Yes, my life here has been marginal. I'm a useless person. I'm being disposed of by the state, but at least now I can kill some other people and affiliate myself with ISIS, right? Yes, I can't pay my medical bills. My family's falling apart. I'm a breadwinner. I'm never going to get a job in this deindustrialized circumstance, but at least I can kill my family, right? Like an expression of pure negativity becomes understood as all you can do, and thus it becomes a type of positivity. And I think that that's where we're at with this type of thing. I think, I can't litigate the question of what like people who want to contend for another possible world will have to do vis-a-vis violence, but I do know whatever they have to do will have to be something other than just minimally reproducing violence, right? They're gonna have to deal with violence, but if that's a dead end, if that's all that's on the table.
Yeah. Suze.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just echoing Pat here, and I talk about this in the book, that the kind of the hollowing out of the state, it's a selective hollowing out, right? Yeah. Where it's a hollowing out of kind of state capacity to intervene on behalf of the kind of public good in like the ways that we might actually like want a state to act. It's not a hollowing out of the coercive, right, violent kind of capabilities of the state, but that these two things are intimately linked. Right, as the state becomes less able to actually provide anything beyond violence, it has to rely more on violence in order to sustain itself. That there's like a fundamental relationship here, which is why I do tend to think about like the rise of these kind of like reactionary, I think of them as kind of like right populist movements, like vis-a-vis state capacity, and the kind of dissolution of state capacity in certain terms, right? But not across the board, as kind of Pat has pointed out here. But that the kind of getting back to the other piece of this question, part of the story then that we're telling here in terms of this transformation of the state, particularly over the last 40 or 50 years, is even that kind of core right to violence is now something that you can outsource. right? So we have privatized our municipal water supplies. We've privatized, like, healthcare. You can privatize education. We can, in a world in which everything is supposed to be a market transaction, it shouldn't be very surprising that violence too can be privatized. That actually fits fully with the story that we're talking about in terms of kind of the transformation under neoliberalism. And that if we step back again and abandon our framework of the medieval and think about the kind of proliferation of kind of Islamic militant groups within that framework of like privatized violence, then I think that this kind of comes a little bit, everything becomes like maybe slightly clearer that like, oh, this actually is a global shift. And it has to do with kind of that selective hollowing out of the state and the dissolution of states, the fragmentation of states. And in that sense, yeah, actually the Middle East and much of the global South is ahead of the game.
Yeah.
It's way ahead of us. And that the, and that this is, this one possible response to that kind of hollowing out of state capacity. And particularly if you think about something like again, like going back to Egypt and to the Ikhwan and the Muslim Brotherhood, they emerge very much as this like social services organization in the 1980s that's going to fill the gaps left by the receding state. Who kind of in the kind of neoliberal pivot to austerity and reform will no longer be able to offer, various like subsidies, et cetera, that they used to. And right, in Ikhwan, they're not ISIS. I don't want to like, conflate these two things.
You should say that's the Muslim Brotherhood for people who don't know
sorry.
Ikhwan. I mean,
but again, thinking about like who is able to, right, like, who is able to provide some modicum of services, of governance, of something, of security, and I mean security not in this like very narrow, like kind of like national security sense, but like in a really broad-based, sense of that word, and yeah, it's just again like thinking about all of these questions, it does make it clear that like the state for various reasons is no longer able to do that in a lot of different contexts for reasons which are different though interconnected, and that there are a whole host of kind of rivals, and those rivals are not just our private military corporations like Blackwater, which is now Academy. They're all of these organizations, they like change names constantly. There's like a whole bunch of them. Many of them grew very rich off of kind of nation building exercises in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. Like it's not just them, but it is again going back to this kind of example about like even like corporate power becomes kind of quasi-sovereign in many instances, and are also wielders of violence in ways that the state can't contain. Right, like part of the story here is that liberalism can't seem to contain its violence anymore. Right, if the Weberian kind of accord that Ajay mentioned, right, about the kind of state being defined as this kind of community that has a monopoly on violence in a given territory, like that is a historically embedded definition of the state, and that works with a certain kind of point of liberalism. And it increasingly, it doesn't seem like that's the world that we live in anymore, and that there is all of this kind of violence that's outside of the state or that is alongside the state, and that the state is frankly very bad at containing. Having again much to do with the kind of like the degradation of state capacity that and the selective hollowing out that we were talking about before.
Yeah. Patrick has to go, so we're gonna let him go.
Kudos again. The book is amazing. Everyone buy the book, please.
Thank you, Pat. Bye, sweetie.
Just to sort of pivot us to one or two more questions off that last one. I mean, just one thing to mention, just to tie the question and Patrick and Susie's very lucid responses to it, is I'll give another little like sort of personal story, which is I was off the internet for like a month, and like when I was leaving the internet, like it was this sort of like maelstrom of the media exploding about how terrible it was that the US was leaving Afghanistan. Or maybe this was just around that time, just before, it was the lead up or something, which of course was the executive policy, not only of President Biden, but was the executive policy of President Trump too. This is two nominally, right, the executives of the state being completely bombarded from all sides, from private military contractors, from former intelligence agents who now kind of quasi speak for intelligence services, at the behest of what? Is I think part of this question. And when I came back on, so that was the sort of maelstrom, and I was just like, oh fuck this shit, this is insane. But it actually is a really interesting question. I think speaks to, Pat just left, but speaks to the point I think he was talking about, where there's different fractions inside this thing you call the state, or different entities, different whatever you want to call them, that have very different needs and desires. And then when it was like yesterday when I was like, all right, time to get back on the internet. I got this event tomorrow. And the thing that was circulating was that image of the giant Amazon warehouse in Mexico, right up against the shanty towns. And of course, this is also a form of quasi-sovereignty, right? And not just in the way that capital has always been sovereign, through the denial of investment power over, let's say liberal democratic societies, yada, 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 but in a much more direct way. Right. And I think that these are some of the sort of root crises that build that terrain that Susie is describing so well in the book. Right. This is what people are responding to differently across the world. And on that point, there was another question, this one from Aruj. Suzanne, can you speak a bit, and Murtaza, if you wish to speak to this as well, go for it. Can you speak a bit more about the theory of horrorism? This is something that is in your book, and ISIS's execution videos. I feel that we often interpret these instances as quote unquote senseless, but there is a logic to the staging, production, and proliferation of such videos, correct?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm kind of drawing on this thinker who kind of lays out this, puts forward a distinction between like terrorism and horrorism, which I found to be, at least in this case, kind of useful. That meaning that like terrorism is experienced. It's directly experienced by you or by kind of those around you, and it kind of sows a certain type of fear. Whereas horrorism is watched, and that's like its prime characteristic, or it's something awful that you're supposed to watch that you're not necessarily going to have a sort of like direct relationship with. So like thinking about like these execution videos, for instance, which are like taking place in like the middle of like the Syrian desert. This is not something that is that we are individually going to be exposed to in that kind of like very subjective way, but this is something that we might watch. So we have this kind of like mediated relationship with a thing. And yes, there is a production quality involved here, right? That these, I mentioned in the book that these videos, they sometimes involve several takes, and that there's like a real like attempt, right, of the prisoners are often, they're dressed in these kind of like, jumpsuits, the orange jumpsuits that are meant to kind of mimic the, detainees at Guantanamo, right? There's an attempt kind of constantly to mimic back the kind of like violence of empire and to make it visible to a population for whom these wars are quite distant and often invisible. So there is a strategic logic of sorts there, but I guess I would want to push back about what exactly that logic is. And this is, I mean, I think this is, totally up for debate. People can have a different view of this, of course, but like, this is something that I actually do find quite nihilistic. And because the individual in these instances is a prop, purely a prop.
Right.
It's a complete disposable human body for a prop in the production of spectacle, much in the same way that kind of victims of mass shootings who are completely anonymous. It doesn't matter who they are, right? You don't have to, you're not killing someone who like directly harmed you or your family or something like that. Even that kind of chain of like individual guilt or responsibility, none of that matters here. This is like completely broken down. And these are props in the production of spectacle. And there is a, like ethically, that raises this kind of issue of kind of a real disposability of the human body, right? Using humans in this kind of anti-categorical imperative sense, right?
Yeah, it's instrumental rationality, of course.
It's right as means, not as ends in themselves. And that the, so it definitely does have a strategic logic of sorts, right? It's meant to inflict the psychological blow that, right, a group like the Islamic State is unable to inflict on the real material plane, right? Like we have nuclear weapons, they do not. Like, let's remember this like fundamental asymmetry that is involved here. but what does it really accomplish? Like, does it get them closer to like conquering various territories or establishing kind of like, you know, sovereign power, replacing like secular forms of governance with like, a caliphate? No, I don't actually think so. So to kind of, again, like follow this chain of my thinking, it's like, well, what is the purpose here? Well, the purpose is spectacle. The purpose is almost like likes, right? In that like really online, like social media sort of way, right? Could be psychological warfare. This is a recruitment strategy. Does it move the needle in material terms? No, but it might like feel good or something in like, right, in this like very perverse sense for their adherents in the moment. And what does it do? Yes, it ultimately treats these human bodies, that those of its victims, as completely disposable, in this way that makes very little sense to me outside of kind of modern history of capitalism. And so, you know, that's kind of, yeah, that's kind of the way that I unpack those, and that the way also that I think about them as spectacles, as things that are meant to be watched. Not again like this form of violence that kind of exists from some sort of primordial time, but something that's very much produced and facilitated by the very means of kind of modern technology and, you know, information networks and communications that we kind of take for granted and use for, you know, various other applications as well.
Great. Murtaza, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I really agree with Susie said about the use of people as props and how grotesque and nihilistic that is. It reminds me of 9/11 too a little bit. 9/11 was purely a spectacle, and it was done for symbolic purposes, more or less. There was not really a grand strategic plan behind it. There was to some degree. It was not very well thought out beyond the initial spectacle, which played out in the world's media capital and was catastrophically successful, you could say. One thing I would say though, that I think that it's hard to impute what the practical reasoning was for ISIS behind their acts, because their own propaganda described it in the own way they preferred to portray it as terrifying as possible. I do think there is a particular, like a lot of what ISIS did, the violence was very like tribal, like it had the vengefulness and the priority on vengeance and the limitless violence. It was rooted in the local dynamics of the region, that border regions of Iraq and Syria where it emerged, where there were these older codes of practice and behavior that could be drawn upon, and the globalized language of Islam could be attached to it. But I do think it served one purpose, which was it instilled great terror in people around the areas where it was taking place. For us, it was very far away. It was a disgusting spectacle, and we're all horrified, and certainly galvanized public opinion against them. If you're living a few miles away from where these acts are taking place, it could be a lot more different feeling, like very visceral feeling, and it was demoralizing for many, like you could say, the Iraqi, the opposition groups to ISIS, the Shia militias, or just locals who were at odds with the group, and it's to go into combat with them on the ground. This group, which had shown itself with this extreme levels of barbarity, nobody wants to end up in one of these ISIS videos. And if you're living in the United States, or even if you're in the U.S. military and your experience of the war is all by air, the possibility that's quite remote. But if there's a possibility you could end up on the ground with those guys, or they're your neighbors, or they're not that far from you, those videos I think did serve a tactical purpose, in that a group which perhaps was not the strongest or most well-armed group at the start of this conflict, it was able to terrify people into fleeing, into leaving their equipment behind. They can confiscate that, and it did serve some sort of purpose in you could say negative marketing, or terrifying people. And I'll say that the other governments, like for instance the Syrian government, did the opposite in a way. During the height of the war, they put out propaganda videos that depicted life in the government regions as idyllic, and even videos of, at the height of the violence, of concerts and people having garden parties with all sorts of food and drink in Aleppo, on the other side of the city, which is not under government siege, to demoralize people on the other side, to say, well, look how amazing life is over here, and perhaps you made the wrong decision, or you'd like to come over here and be co-opted by us. And I think that these on the practical level, they do serve some purpose, but you have to divine the purpose a bit different from what they're saying. And if you look at their propaganda, it's served to galvanize the U.S. Response against ISIS, in my opinion. I think that even if it had a tactical purpose, strategically it was very self-defeating, because absent the videos of the beheadings of US journalists, which, as Susie said, they didn't really mean much in a broader sense. They were these spectacular events or non-events. It certainly meant something to the victims of them and their families, but they didn't have a political nature in of themselves, other than the fact that they're advertised as like an insult or a threat to the United States and Americans. Absent those videos, I'm not sure there would have been such a wide-ranging military intervention against Islamic State by the United States. They served to galvanize that, and it was quite self-defeating, as we've seen the destruction of the caliphate by primarily US Air Force.
Yeah, no, 1,000%. I think that that's like a really important point about like, right, how these things are greeted on the ground locally versus like how they're viewed from afar, and that they do have kind of, you know, different purposes, I think, for different audiences. But yes, I also view it as like ultimately self-defeating, which is again kind of like brings me back to like the nihilism piece, where it's and that this is not something that should be so unfamiliar, but right, so we're living in this world where there are no alternatives, where, as we've kind of mentioned, kind of like more traditional like quarters that might be opposed to a repressive state from the left have been kind of like thoroughly gutted and lost their prime kind of patron at the end of the Cold War. And but that yet, right, that because an organization like ISIS at the end of the day so fully internalizes the logic of neoliberalism, even as it claims to negate it, it is in no position to offer an alternative.
Yeah, I mean, you so thoroughly make the case of ISIS as like neoliberalism par excellence, and that sort of volunteerism, almost like magical volunteerism that Pat was describing, is so perfect.
And so that, right, so the move is one to like, yeah, you recognize that there really is human suffering here. There really is a legitimation crisis. There really is a kind of absence of the state in any sort of positive sense. But what are you positing as the alternative? The thing that you're positing as the alternative is not going to lead to any sort of like mass human flourishing. If we're really going to, right, beyond even like American military intervention, right, what happens to the caliphate as it's kind of, you know, quasi-sovereign in Syria and Iraq is that it rules through extortion until essentially it's like base completely collapse, like the social base collapses. And that is kind of a piece of the story as well. It's not just that it's getting bombarded from kind of, you know, from the air, but that real like the social, any sort of social basis for it is collapsing, as well as it proves itself unable to actually to provide a real alternative of the type that people might actually want. And I think that that's like a really like, right, if there's that's kind of, maybe it's like a good place to kind of wrap this up, but particularly when we think about these like organizations in the West that posit themselves as kind of an alternative to a status quo, as to ask, well, what type of alternative is this? Is this something that is actually going to lead to some sort of like more broad-based, again, like freedom or human flourishing? Or is this something that is so trapped up in the logic of what it claims to negate that it cannot do that, and in all likelihood is going to just like lead us to like greater human suffering? And right, so that's I see echoes of that definitely, you know, kind of closer to home here as well.
Suze, do you want to end on that, or do you want to take one more, or how do you want to go?
Well, I feel like we should wrap up pretty soon. I mean, if there's like one more that's short, but otherwise,
yeah,
like,
there's one more,
and I don't want to belabor it for too long.
There's one more that dovetails well, and then so let's end on this one. So Matthew asks, you use the word neo-feudalism in your book, albeit once. Were you aiming at predicting the emergence of another era of capitalism like neoliberalism has been, or were you gesturing toward a possible new mode of production? Thanks.
It's a great, is a great question. I mean, I think that the way that I'm using it in the book is particularly around this kind of question of like the centrality of the state as a like mediating force in people's lives, and the kind of the very possibility of like public goods and services that goes along with that. And when I'm thinking about neo-feudalism, I'm thinking about things like the increasingly not kind of stemming out of the increasing privatization of everything, right? I talk about this like, right, the private firefighters, right, Ajay, picking up on your point about that. But like, right, just like private, like detachable infrastructure, right? People building their own little, like, climate safe compounds in various places, right? Right now, we talk about people who during kind of COVID-19, they don't want to send their children to school. So they've like hired their private tutors who, are just with them and doing like homeschool, right? There is all sorts of ways in which the kind of like public goods and services are like either increasingly difficult to access or we're just unable to access them, or their provision is no longer what it used to be, or even for people for whom they had it, and to say nothing of those for whom like they never really had access to those kind of public goods and services. In which they're looking for various kind of private solutions to that. So I've been thinking about that in neo-feudalism, chiefly in those terms, as this kind of like, right, not a return, but a new instantiation of kind of the private provision of various things, apart from or aside from the state. But yes, I mean, I think it does kind of go alongside these shifts in kind of production. Even right during the pandemic, you've seen this, like who's able to work from home, who's able not to work from home, where do you actually have to be, right? The kind of like the hypermobility of certain forms of labor. Not all, but certain forms of labor.
And the hyper locality of others. Yes.
In this economy, I think is something that is kind of also part of that kind of like neo-feudal story.
If I could just, I'll add here. So neo-feudalism is a word that several people use. It goes farther back. I know I've used it in my own work since at least 2015, and Susie just referenced some later uses of it in some of my climate stuff. But there's the way that this question is framed, really sort of is asking about modes of production. And if you think about like globalization and the decrease of productivity and all this kind of stuff, and the emergence of a largely rent-based economy in the sort of post-crash financial sort of world of whatever, international finance and all this kind of stuff, you do get a kind of weird, like, is this still, there's a joke, right? Mackenzie Work has that book, like, is this still capitalism or is it something worse? And I think he also uses, she also uses neo-feudalism in there. And so I think there is a way of thinking about it as new mode of production. There's ways of thinking about it, new modes of security arrangements. And I think that leads you directly back into the kinds of phenomenon that actually, I mean, I'll actually, Susie, give you a plug that is more than what you have given yourself. You said potential future, actually potential present, right? ISIS, Al Qaeda, these things, they decimated here, they come back here, whatever. But these are phenomena, this and the Amazon plant or the Amazon warehouse in Mexico, these are phenomena of our moment. They are not in some funny Tom Cruise dystopia film that's, coming out next year, right? This is part of the world that we live in and that Susie describes so well in this book. And so, if there's no final comments, so Susie?
No, I said I feel like we should wrap up. It's 2 hours. I feel like it's about like the limit for these like digital talks. But no, I just wanted to say thank you, Ajay, thank you, Murtaza and Pat, who had to sign off, and Dan for running our tech, and just really everyone who helped to make this event happen. Both here and like kind of in the sidelines. It means the world to me to be able to kind of talk about this work with you and to celebrate it with you. So thank you.
Thank you. Everyone.
Congratulations on the book. Go buy the book.
Yes, people, go buy the book. Murtaza, it's very nice to talk to you. And also thank you to our partners at Verso at Community Bookstore. And of course, to Dan, who's been running the show, and Susie for writing the book and answering all these wonderful questions. And thanks for all for watching. Bye.
Bye.